of chapter 5 deals with active transport. And we learned in the first part of chapter 5 about passive transport. Passive, as its name implies, does not require energy. Transport, getting something across a membrane or getting something where it needs to be. Now, active transport, as its name implies, active is going to require energy. So passive transport does not require energy. Active transport is the process that requires energy. The next thing to talk about in section 2 of chapter 5 is a system called the sodium-potassium pump. And we'll learn about that in a lot of detail. And then talk about some ways that the sodium-potassium pump is essential for your cells, but it's in form of active transport. Sodium-potassium pump is going to require energy. And then finally, we'll talk about the difference between ways of getting things into the cell and out of the cell that are too big to kind of just go through the membrane. So those are endocytosis and exocytosis. As their name implies, membrane pumps are found in the plasma membrane. And as when we learned about the plasma membrane, we're talking about proteins that are found in the membrane. And membrane pumps are going to require energy because they're going to be doing work, active transport. And active transport, let's define that first. Active transport, as its name implies, I keep saying that name implies, but I just want you to understand that these terms make sense if you think about what they're doing. Moving molecules, that's a transport, across the membrane. We're all talking about getting things in and out of the cell. But instead of like in passive transport, remember passive transport went from high to low. In active transport, it's the opposite. It's going to go from low to high. So that's the part that requires that it has energy. It takes things from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. And because it does that, it's going to require energy. Active transport requires energy. Passive transport does not. Active transport requires energy. Some types of active transport are done by protein pumps. So active transport can be done by a carrier protein in the membrane called a pump. And again, forgive my underlining here, dealing with trying to do this without a pen or even a mouse today. Oops. So active transport sometimes happens by a carrier protein in the membrane called a pump. And one of the very famous and ones that we have to learn about because it's absolutely essential for life is the sodium-potassium pump. And let's first learn about what it does, and then we'll show you some examples of how it's used in the body. But it's very important to remember here. Sodium, and we want to remember our symbols here. I know we didn't have to learn a lot of them, but sodium, and these two are kind of strange ones, and they don't match up alphabetically with the sodium and potassium words. But sodium, as you remember from chapter 2, is Na, and potassium is K. And it's going to take 3 sodium out of the cell for every 2 potassium it moves into the cell. So let's try to show that happening here. It's going to be taking out of the cell, try to draw my arrows here, 3 sodium 3 sodium out of the cell for every 2 potassium. Give this chicken scratch. For every 2 potassium that go into the cell. So 3 sodium out for every 2 potassium in. And the way that the cell, remember it's active transport, so it's going to need to have energy. The way that it does that is by ATP. As you know, ATP is our energy currency for the cell. So ATP is used in the sodium-potassium pump for energy. 3 sodium go out of the cell for every 2 potassium that go into the cell.